Hello. We're going to start working with structures, classes, and objects. In this course, almost everything we do is usually based around this fundamental idea that we're going to be using a class to represent some concept that has a real-life equivalent. So a lot of the examples you're going to see are going to be about making something that we understand in real life and representing it with code. It's this concept of abstraction, which we'll learn even more about later on in the course. So without further ado, our first exercise has us making an animal class. And think about it. What kinds of attributes and methods might an animal have? Include these in your code and instantiate, meaning create, two different animals in your main method. So here we want to distinguish between the concept of what it is to be an animal and actually making animals. And our program is going to need to do both. So in our public videos in 0 to a structures, let's get started with example 1. And here is our instructions. Let's include our usuals so that we have them there. And we're going to make a class called animal. I like to put the braces immediately followed by a semicolon so I don't forget that I'm going to need all of these things. And now inside I can actually put the stuff that I need. So what things might an animal have? Probably an animal has a name. That would make sense. Probably an animal has an age might make sense. We also want to think about what methods an animal might have. So an animal might have a method called void roar, which doesn't really need any parameters because or perhaps not roar, not all animals roar, but all animals probably make a noise, or at least a lot of them do, so that's probably more useful. And I think that's probably good enough for now. If we want to add some more things, maybe we want to add void move. An animal can move perhaps, and we can implement these methods however we like. So perhaps for now we'll keep things simple, and our void make noise method is just going to make some noise. In fact, maybe something that makes sense is the noise that it makes. So we'll have a string called noise, and then the animal will make the noise when we call make noise. And so here we can say, all right, whenever we call make noise, see out their noise. Animal name is making noise, and then they make their noise. Sounds good to me. Also need to specify that this make noise function isn't just some random function, but it actually belongs to the animal class. And I also want a move function, so we'll call this move. And here we'll just say animal is moving. Okay, so we got an animal, it's got some properties, it can make noise. Now, we need to actually instantiate some animals. We need to actually make some. So in our main function here, I can say I have an animal, cat, animal dog. And now if I want to say my dog's name is Cheeto, that's the name of my dog, we're going to find that this code is not going to work. Let's see why. So the error we get is that the name is private within this context. And what that means is that by default, you can't actually access the properties of an animal outside of the animal class itself. And so since the name and the age and the noise and these functions are all not specified, they default to being private. So to make sure I can actually do stuff with it, I need to label them as public. There we go. Now everything compiles. Now I've made a dog and I've given it a name, but I want to actually see it making a noise. So let's say dog.noise is woof, and we'll do dog.make noise. All right, let's go. Compile, run. Animal Cheeto is making noise, woof. There it is, that's it. So make my dog, give my dog a name, give my dog a noise, and make that noise. And I can repeat the same thing with the cat. Garfield says meow. Compile and run. And now Garfield says meow, Cheeto says woof, and everything as an animal should. Okay, let's move on. So, in our next exercise, we're going to modify our animal class to have two different names. One for its species, such as panther, and one for its unique name, such as Fluffy. Species will be a private variable, and we'll use a public method info that writes out both of the names. So I will duplicate my code from before, and we'll make some changes. Okay, so right now I just have my normal name, which is my unique name, and we'll have another name that's its species that has to be a private variable species. And now I need a public method called info that's going to print out these names. And I can, if I want to make this outside, I can write it outside of the class like I kind of have below, or I can actually just write it right here if I feel like it. And so I'll do that. And I'll just say name is a species. And we'll do cat.info and dog.info. And we probably need to give these species, so let's give them, so obviously a cat species is cat. Probably there's a more specific term for it, but I'm not a biologist. Cat.species. But we're now kind of presented with a problem, right? Which is, because species is a private variable, I don't really have any way to set it. So if I run my method, example 2, Garfield is a blank, Cheeto is a blank, because I haven't set it. Now, if I want, I can give it a default value. I can say species equals animal. Not very accurate, but not totally wrong, I guess. It kind of is wrong. But if I run this, you can see Garfield is an animal, Cheeto is an animal, but this isn't ideal. So we're going to need some way to fix this, which I think we're going to get to do in the next exercise. So let's try that out. Okay. So here we're going to have getters and setters for its species name. So we'll do that first, and then we'll move on to the second part after. So we'll duplicate this. Okay. So let's do the first part first, and we'll worry about the second part after, which is going to, I think, go before our main function. But I'm going to ignore that for now, and I'm just going to modify my animal class to have getters and setters for its species name. So I'm not going to default it to animal, because that's kind of silly. Instead, what I will do is I will have a public function void set species, and it will take a string s, and it will set the species to be s. And I'll also have a string function get species that will simply return the species. And now with this very short code, I now have ways to access this species using these public functions. And if you're wondering why would you ever do this, sometimes your set and get functions are a little more complicated than what we see here. Here it's pretty simple. If I want to set the species to something, I just set it. But maybe there's some restrictions. Maybe species, maybe the value of s has to be something from some database, and if it doesn't match anything in the database, it's not a valid point of entry. This would be the code where you can set what is a valid property to be set as a species, as opposed to just allowing anything. Similarly, when you get the species, maybe it's the case that whatever is calling this has some restrictions that you want to set upon it. But in our case, we're just going to keep it as simple as possible, which is setting the species and getting the species. And so now down below, I can say cat.setSpecies, which is cat, and dog.setSpecies to dog. And now I run my code again. Now I can see Garfield is a cat and Cheeto is a dog. Hooray! Now, there was a second part that we have to do, which is a new class. This class is called Habitat. It represents an animal's home. We're going to include in this class a private variable that represents the owner, which is an animal. So this one is pretty simple. I'm going to have a class called Habitat. we have a private variable that represents the owner, which is an animal. And if I want to have an animal as an owner, but it wants to be a particular animal, not just a brand new one created for this habitat, it should be an animal pointer called the owner. And that's it for now. I can make my habitat, obviously. Habitat, cave, if I feel like it. But because this is private, I can't really do much about it. But perhaps I want to be able to do so. Then what I can do is I can make some public functions, such as void set owner, given a pointer to an animal. We'll say the owner is O. And we also can do a display owner info, where we simply say owner.info. Oh, sorry, owner. So if I do owner.info, I believe it will give me an error. Let's double check if that's true. Yes, so the error I get has to do with trying to access owner.info, because you should be using owner arrow info since owner is a pointer. So changing this to an arrow, we're then going to make sure it works by saying cave.set owner to be the address of my dog. So that way when I do cave.display owner info, it should show me Cheeto's info. Let's comment out the other noises we're making and other information and see if that works. And there we go. Cheeto is a dog, and Cheeto is the owner. And perhaps to make this slightly more useful, we will say who the owner is. So and there we go. So now when I call habitat, it will say the owner of this habitat is, and then it will say Cheeto is a dog. Hooray. So my habitat now connects with my animal class in a way that kind of makes sense. When I make a habitat, I can give it an owner from an animal that already exists, and I can access their info, even though the owner variable is private, because I have these public methods that allow me to interact with it. Okay, one more exercise, and then we'll wrap it up. So let's take a look. Extend my existing habitat class by adding a constructor. The constructor should have a single parameter, which is the animal owner. Then add an info method to indicate the owner of the habitat. So I accidentally did this in the wrong order, where I did the info method first, but that is okay. We just skipped a little bit. So totally fine. Let's duplicate this. So we've done that already, and then we have new instructions to follow here, which is to add a constructor to my habitat. So first of all, the habitat has a constructor that must be called habitat. You cannot call your habitat constructor anything other than this, or it simply will not work. Now, the single parameter is the animal owner. And what is that? Well, that is an animal pointer. And there are two ways you can make this constructor work. One of them is the way that probably makes the most sense, which is owner equals O. And now I have set the owner of the habitat to be this parameter of the constructor, which means now when I make my habitat equals habitat dog, I can skip this line of code, and it will still do the same thing. Oops, sorry, compile 4. Oh, no, I have a mistake. Right, because if you see here, no matching function for call to animal habitat animal reference where I say dog, and the reason for that is over here I'm expecting an animal pointer. Over here I am passing an animal object, and that's not right. I need to pass a reference to Cheeto, not Cheeto himself. What do we have now? Oh, sorry, I have the ampersand on the wrong side. It's the address of Cheeto, not Cheeto address. There we go. And hey, we still have our owner in the right spot. Now, we already have our display info right here, which I guess you can call it info, I suppose, isn't a problem. Info. But the other thing I want to point out is that this is not the only way to write a constructor. So another way that you can do this is a shorthand commonly used when you have a lot of parameters. But here I can demonstrate with just one, which is if I have a constructor, which takes an animal pointer, I can say that I want the owner variable to be O. And so this is a shorthand you'll see quite often, and what it represents is a way that you can, with a comma-separated list, actually go through all of the different variables that you want to assign as part of your constructor. So one thing you might want to do, for instance, is say you have your habitat have a name. So perhaps there is a string name for your habitat, and we want to set it in the constructor. Well, I can say that I also want a string name and an animal O. In addition to setting the owner, I'm going to set the name to be M. And now what I've done is, using this shorthand, I now allow a habitat to be constructed with both a name and an animal. In fact, it has to have a name and an animal. The owner becomes the owner, and the name is assigned as the name. And instead of saying the owner of this habitat, I will say the owner of name is, and then the owner. And now when I create my habitat, I will say habitat cave, comma, dog, and let's see what happens. And now I say the owner of cave is what it is. So now my habitat has more properties, but I can easily add them into the constructor using this syntax you may not have seen before. Every parameter you're passing needs to be inside of these parentheses here. Then you have your colon, and after the colon is a comma-separated list of every variable you want to have, followed by parenthesis, followed by the name of the parameter you're putting into it. So the name of it is going to be N, the owner is going to be O, and so on. And if you have more code you want to run, you can put it inside these braces here, which are mandatory. But if you don't want to do anything else, which in this case I don't, I can just leave them blank. So that wraps up our brief refresher of classes, most of which you should have seen in Programming Workshop 1. So hopefully all of this was fairly familiar and should, at least ring a few bells of stuff that we did last semester. Otherwise, this sets the tone of how we're going to be working with classes this semester, and hopefully we're going to be doing some more exciting things together very, very soon. So I hope to see you there. Thanks for watching the video. See you around.